The accusation that gets levied against women is like, oh, they just want to like eat, pray, love, and they want a girl boss. Like it's this very freewheeling, hedonistic excuse not to have kids. I actually think the reverse is true. Having kids is this very risky, chaotic, volatile path to choose in comparison with their other options now. And having kids is a way of aggressively stepping outside that really predictable environment. If you're thinking of the threats being some other polity than like an aging society, you obviously straightforwardly don't want that. That makes no sense. But if you're thinking of the threat as being your own people, then yeah, maybe you want your own people to be weak and tired and old and sick.
Hi, welcome. This is the From the New World podcast. Today I'm speaking with Kevin Dolan, the founder of Exit Group and the organizer of the Natalism Conference. We discuss pronatalism, the problems of social science, ancient philosophy, and what happens after a regime change. If that sounds interesting to you, the best way to help us out is to let a friend know, either in person or online. That way you're not only helping us, but you're helping someone you know find something interesting and informative. Another thing you can do if you like the show is to sign up for the Natalism Conference, which once again, Kevin is hosting, and I'll also be there. So it's a great place to learn more about some of these fundamental questions, and the link for that will also be below. Without further ado, here's Kevin Dolan. So you do two things. You run the Exit Group and you run the Natalism Conference. What ties the two together?
Yeah, so NatalCon was actually born out of an Exit meetup. It was me and a couple of the guys, and we were talking about kind of what are we doing here? Why are we? So it's a fraternity. It's built around sovereignty and sort of pushing back against the monoculture, as Malcolm and Simone would call it. Basically creating parallel institutions, parallel structures to get what our guys need as those systems become increasingly hostile. And we were talking about like, why do we care so much about this? Like, why do we feel the need to run our mouths on the internet? Why do we like what unites us as people? And we realized it was like, oh, well, we all want to have grandkids. We all want to have families, and this liberal monoculture is sort of unremittingly hostile to that. And so that's why we need to be in control of our employment, be in control of the way our kids are educated, be in control of how we get the basic things that we need, so that we can rebuild a culture that's not hostile to all those things. We were at a meetup watching Tucker Carlson's The End of Men, which is about the kind of medical side of like microplastics and sperm count decline and all those problems. And I thought, maybe there's a broader conversation to be had here. And we could talk about the dating situation. We could talk about why it's hard to get married, why it's hard to, once you're married, to have kids and have lots of kids. And so, yeah, we brought together the smartest people we could find to come and address that topic.
One of the reasons you might want to exit from the mainstream is that it's really anti-natalist, right? It just makes it incredibly inconvenient and low status, and it just creates all sorts of problems if you want to have kids.
Yeah.
And we talked about this a little bit offline. There's also a kind of like almost spiritual connection or a kind of personal connection. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I would say natalism is the why and exit is the how. So
that's amazing.
Well, we recognize that we have this problem, and natalism is often discussed in the context of like these big picture economic things like Europe's pensions or social security or China having enough soldiers or something. Like it's very like macro, it's very political. And a lot of people rightly say, I'm not going to have kids like for that. I'm not going to have kids to save Social Security or the housing market or something like that's stupid. That's, I think, why policymakers should care about it. But really, it's something that individuals already want. like having a family, having children is like this basic human experience that like closes all these psychological loops that don't close any other way. That's why individuals care about it. And we're raising that to the policymakers and being like, hey, you should get involved in helping these people. You should be building a society that works for these people and helps them to fulfill this basic human need, because if you don't, it's going to destroy like all of these institutions that you depend on.
I guess it's been a while since I've talked about this, so if for the audience, you can just give us a refresher on like what exactly are the ways that the monoculture has become so antinatalist.
For one thing, just like culturally, I remember having my fourth kid and being and going to the office, and it was the first time people stopped saying congratulations and they started saying like, "Oh, wow. Wow, that's a lot."
At least they said congratulations the first 3 times.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Three's about the limit.
That surprises me already. But sorry, go on.
Yeah. So there's like just sort of baseline cultural things, but I mean, there's also structural things, like just the fact that like all jobs and the housing market and everything is priced with the assumption that most people live in two income households, and so that makes it difficult for basically the daycare math stops making sense at two kids. If you're making an average American income uh, as a household and you have three kids, it's like, well, it doesn't make sense anymore to do daycare. Someone should probably just stay home, which that's a very difficult transition for a lot of people to manage, and so they just don't. So there's like this kind of hard cap on family size. From a legal perspective, the fact that marriage is sort of an unenforceable contract, that we don't have social expectations that keep people together, that gets framed in really like coercive terms, like we have to like make people stay together. That's not what I'm saying. All contracts exist to help people coordinate their incentives. Like contracts are useful, and two people who actually trust each other and want to work together and like each other will often still sign a contract because it makes the expectations clear, and it helps them to coordinate and collaborate. It's not strictly like a club that I'm going to hold over your head if you don't do the right thing. It's actually a way of coordinating incentives. So the fact that that is broken down makes us that everybody's trying to figure out what a relationship should look from first principles out of the ether, and like most people like aren't equipped to do that and don't have time to do that, and so the search costs of starting a family have gone through the roof. The ways people find people are really deranged now. It's incredibly difficult to
Yeah, the
like,
dating apps.
yeah, or
Yeah.
bars. Like it's really bad. Everything about the culture is organized around the the hedonic experience of individuals, and that just kind of militates against family formation.
Yeah, and there's this either ignorance or in some cases outright hostility to the idea that you can become a better person, right? That these things, I think the older story is that you would get married, you would, you would get mentorship, you would grow up in a community, and all of these things were things that formed you that, yeah, in some ways, took away your choices or at least like put pressure on you, right? Put social pressure, maybe not by law. As you said, gives you incentives to do certain things, and that these would form you into a better person. And in fact, you needed to do that if you wanted to be a better person, and that there is such a thing as a better person. And all of those groundings that I think people have believed for, basically all of human history until very recently, they seem to be going away. It's a very simple story where one of those things is just starting a family, getting married, having kids. That's one of the things that makes you a better person. And, one of the reasons why people have stopped doing that is that we've stopped acknowledging it. And then there's a deeper thing, and this is the question raised by people like Strauss, that the entire way of organizing our economy, of organizing our institutions, have played towards this, rejection of the idea that you can become a better person, and that maybe
Yeah.
relates more to exit group.
I don't know if this is actually Bap's coinage, but I like his phrase, "the war on distinction."
Yes, this is
Um,
very important.
the idea that basically nothing can be better than anything else. Nothing can be recognized as superior to anything else. In the big picture, it's like anything that reveals disparate impact is a problem, and that's like that gets framed as if it's some sort of like narrow policy problem. Like we have this disparate impact thing, and if we got rid of that, then everything would be better. But like actually, the structure of the society is built around, and like the way the state eats, the way the state grows in power and expands, is by identifying a conflict between a stronger party and a weaker party, and taking the part of the weaker party so that it can sort of eat the stronger party and consume its power and take on its responsibilities. Um, you see that very clearly with like these various like independence movements inside the EU. The Catalonians or the Scots are like super pro Europe. They're very like we're being picked on by the big bad, England or Spain. But really, what it is it's the EU trying to eat the sovereignty of these little constituent parts. Um, but that extends beyond the state level. It extends into the basics of family life and employment. Part of the reason the society is so overregulated is because the state is saying, we're going to decide how you can interact with your employees, and the state is saying to husbands, we're going to say how you can interact with your wives, and parents, we're going to say how you can interact with your children. And in every case, the the stronger party, like the state, can sort of point to some bad behavior on the part of at least some people and say this is immoral, this has to stop. Uh, but there's basically no limit to that. There's no limit to the intervention. This like literal leveling, no stone left upon another of like all human hierarchies, which basically leaves you naked and alone with it. Just it's just you and the state, the giant, overwhelming state. In the short run, you can see why there's so many constituencies who are like, yeah, my dad was abusive, or my husband was abusive, or my boss is a dick, or whatever it is, and root for that hierarchy to be dismantled. But those alternate hierarchies, those alternative institutions, uh, form sort of the only resistance to the power of the state. And when the state, it's just like Walmart moves in, they undercut prices, and they kill mom and pop, and then they jack up the price. That's the essential phenomenon that we're describing.
Yeah, and in history, this would be squarely identified with one thing, one structure, one political structure, which is empire. That is what empires do. They go in, they disrupt the local authority by appealing to, local disagreements, local
Right.
blood feuds, and they use that to take over, maybe, you could say more favorably to gain allies, but ultimately to conquer. And on one hand, there's a very interesting story of how a lot of the kind of counter-terror, counter-disinformation programs um, got started, which was through foreign policy as literal counter-terror, as like counter foreign terrorists, Al Qaeda, so on, right? And then that evolved into a domestic control mechanism,
Right.
and I think that's true. It's documented excellently by Jacob Siegel and Mike Benz, and Jacob really brought this to my attention, so I'm always grateful to him for that. And then there's another, to me, more interesting story, which is a kind of story where the empire has run out of frontier, right? We often talk about how like the
Yes.
American settler personality has run out of the frontier, but maybe more
Yes.
destructively, the empire has run out of frontier. And what is the new frontier of the empire? It is a kind of psychological control mechanism, right?
Right.
And this maybe seems like kind of banal, but I really want to emphasize this point because I think if you're talking to like a Roman, and they're like, yeah, this is how empire behaves. We're going to conquer people. And then you go one step further and like, no, next you conquer people's minds. Next
Right.
you take all of these values, all of these spheres of society, all of these sacred beliefs, and you wrap those into the power of the empire. I think this is something that would just come as a complete and total shock to them. This would be, witchcraft. They would just have no practical concept of it.
Yeah.
And that story, I think,
Well, I was going to say I gave a talk in Ecuador last year about kind of this topic, how empires, how there's this constant tension between the power of scale and the power of human cohesion. There's a lot of power to be had in being very tightly aligned with other people, right? But there's also a lot of power in just having a lot of people. Human civilization could almost be understood as this reaching out for, like, how can we create greater cohesion at greater scale. It starts with basically the family, right? We have this very clear genetic biological reason to have shared interests, and then you get things like one family conquers another, and they're sort of deploying the resources of the other family or the other clan or the other tribe, and that expands the scale, the influence of that family. And then you get things like aristocracy, where it's a whole class of people utilizing the resources of another whole class of people. And then the feudal system, where it's fractal, recursive relationships between families that allow for things to scale up. At every level of abstraction, it is still an abstraction of the family. It's either patronage in the case of aristocracy, so the patron being the father figure, or it's the patria, the fatherland, or it's the pater patria, the father of the nation, the king. It's always this abstraction of the relationships that are supposed to exist between family. And the case I was making was essentially that as we've scaled up to the global scale, you get Western liberalism, which is basically run out of enemies, run out of frontier, like you might say. And in the absence of those enemies, it's had to turn inward to the people and make them the threat. Like, the threat that we exist to protect you from is actually each other. Prior to this, you could still use those sort of fundamental roots of the psychological circuits of parenthood and family to help people connect and be like, this is what's us and this is what's them, right? Because we have a shared nation, a shared nativity. We come from the same stock. We are, in some sense, a family. Once you go global, though, once you're sort of trying to encompass all of humanity, it's like that relationship of family connection has been sort of abstracted away to infinity because it doesn't exclude anything. It can't mean anything. Every category is defined by what it excludes, and so there is no box in which to put people. And so you end up with a society that's gradually, like, instead of riding on those circuits of intimacy, it's now eating them, it's consuming them, it's destroying them and breaking them down in order to maintain power. And basically, my thesis was that's not sustainable. That's going to end.
Yeah,
Um,
I think it's really important to get this history right because, and I'm not saying that you're necessarily getting it wrong, but I hear a lot of people with this telling of the history, which is something like, well, the state conspired to create this massive kind of like Soviet style social engineering project and to like
mhm.
completely deracinate people
Yeah,
and, make them infertile and effeminate
yeah,
and the last man. That almost gets the causation backwards. You kind of get the last man first before you get the social planning. Even though there's certainly like censorship, there's certainly elements of authoritarian rule, but I think that it's so important to get the history right because it actually tells us more about the problem that we're dealing with. Like, if we are just dealing with a conspiracy to make people weak, then you just need to defeat the conspiracy, right? You
Right,
do the regime
right.
change. Maybe we're doing the regime change now, and then it's over. And then the Patriots are in control, and we don't really have to think about it
Yeah.
anymore. We've
No,
solved the
no.
problem.
We're talking about an
And
incentive
yes,
gradient that goes all the way back to like ancient Egypt. Like it's not a conspiracy. It's a natural evolution, and it's the evolution of power in response to growing growing technological returns to scale.
there's a yes and no there, where Nick Land will have this very entertaining term. I think you I see you smiling. I think you're gonna guess what I'm gonna say, but Nick Land has this term called hyper racism. And hyper racism is, it's really not racism at all, but it's essentially either capitalism or just metrics, right? Things like IQ, individualism, right? It's measuring people in a hyper specific way, but in a very, but to an extent that's like basically individual, or near individual.
Mm.
And he uses this term, and it's, it's a bit provocative because it's kind of, um,
So it's like a hyper
it's
race, like
kind
a
of a
racism of
reverse, it's
one.
it's kind of a reverse euphemism, right?
Yeah.
It's not, it's taking something that's honestly like a pretty normal part of life and calling it hyper racism. But the provocation is that in some ways we have a much more selective society, right? And we do have a society that in some ways can create, amazing things, the greatest rockets in the world. It's interesting because you do get both. So here's where I want to give credit to you. As there is this kind of selection for efficiency, and for, in some ways, a much more judgmental and specific system, you also get this clamoring for safety. And every political theorist will tell you that there's a link between safety and obedience. Where that perspective gets things right is that I don't think the desire for homogeneity comes from scale, but I do think it comes from the kind of after effects of scale. That's where I think you get it right. It's the after effect of this kind of hyper selective system, the consequence of hyper selection. It's this hyper, specialized system, and then once you get the specialized system, you just fail to look at the whole. And once you fail to look at the whole, you end up with these people who are kind of haplessly dependent because they don't know what's going on. If they get fired, if they get even moved to a different department, they become much more dependent. They become much more dependent on protection. And,
Yeah.
as we just said, they enter this relationship of protection and obedience.
Yeah, I think certainly the more you are a hyper specialized widget in a big machine, the certainly the less like sort of transferable your skills become, the more you become more like an organ or even a cell than an organism. That's part of what I saw happening just like in this really quotidian sense with my career. Like I was a government finance drone, and realizing that I was developing skills that had no other meaning in any other context. And eventually it'd be very hard to sort of move laterally out of that. I meet a lot of guys who are in similar situations. And so, like, a lot of what I try to do with Exit in terms of creating sovereignty is putting people more in control of their process of value generation. The workers controlling the means of production, right? Like, how much of your how much of the value you generate is dependent on capital that belongs to somebody else. Can you do your job from a laptop? Can you do your job remotely. Sales jobs, for instance, there are sales jobs where like you need to be fed your leads from on high, and if that flow stops, then you're screwed. There are other sales jobs where like you are a relationship manager, and the people to whom you sell are like connected to you personally more than the product. And like if you leave, your book of business leaves with you, and those people have like significant sovereignty. A lot of the like, we should all go be plumbers, a lot of that discourse is to some extent predicated on people's superficial like
Yeah,
their
it's
sort of
vibes.
poetic ideas about the trades, yeah, vibes, right?
Yeah,
But there
yeah.
is like, but you do meet guys who like run a window tinting business or something, and they can. I mean, those guys fed post on Facebook like crazy, and it's because their customers can't really fire them. Like they have kind of an infinite supply of customers. There's no what you'd call like a monopsony or oligopsony of a few buyers for their thing, and so they're able to speak their mind. I don't think it's about any one particular like line of work. It's about how in control are you uh, of the way you generate value.
There's something interesting here, which biology will often say like history is flowing in reverse, right? That history was kind of
Yeah.
favoring a centralized state up until circa 1960, and then it began favoring a more decentralized, an incrementally more decentralized system until the present, basically. Right? Would you agree with that?
Aggressive in how he pattern matches about that.
Yeah,
But I think in
a
general, the
little
trend toward
aggressive.
decentralization is right.
So you're doing exit group. Here's the thing that I'm really curious about the kind of like independent small business owners. How many of them like miss being in like a broader hierarchy?
Uh, Not a ton. I mean, I've known people who sometimes miss like just not having to worry about it so much, like not having to worry about where things are going to come from. But these guys, they sort of build their own social connections outside of that or within their business. I don't think there's a ton of regret about sort of leaving the wage cage. Not that I've seen.
Yeah, I do think it's definitely a minority. But there is a kind of symptom of like there's a type of guy in Silicon Valley who is like some like ex big tech software engineer, very talented software engineer, does a startup and just like doesn't like the feel of it. Just wants to go back to working in big tech, doing the like very clearly defined set of problems, not having to in some ways deal with so much change. Um,
Well, I think tech companies in particular, like especially sort of the prestige tech companies, are built around incorporating the entrepreneurial impulse better than I think most companies are. And so I could see someone in those contexts specifically being like, actually they created like a really intellectually stimulating environment for me to work in. The team was stronger than what I could attract personally. So I can actually see that maybe in Silicon Valley in particular, places that have a strong innovation culture and that sort of bring together like a dream team that you might otherwise struggle to find.
I don't think that's quite it though. That's not the thing. That's not the thing that I hear. I specifically hear predictability. I think that looking at especially the startup aesthetic, you can tell why, right? Because a lot of it is like there's a new problem every day, and a lot of it is not particularly glamorous or interesting.
Hmm.
And in some ways, you mentioned that it's intellectually stimulating. I think that's the part that you get right, where like you can just solve the same class of interesting technical problems that does actually require you to think, every single day.
Hmm.
That's definitely something that I hear a lot. The
Yeah.
underlying question for all of this is like once again, I don't think that we're here by accident. I don't think it's just the case that like, oh, we everyone's stuck in these jobs that like no one actually wants to do. I think that's unrealistic, and I think that a lot of people are lying to themselves when they say
Oh,
that. I think that
totally.
there are a
No,
lot of
no,
people
no.
who like want the stability. Go
Yeah,
on.
no, absolutely. The fact is, the majority of people pay a premium to their boss. So communists talk about this, right? Like you're sort of it's
Yeah, the excess
they're,
labor. Yeah.
they're stealing your labor, right? What is in fact happening is that you are paying a premium for someone else to tell you what to do. Um, and that is a
Yeah, it's
price that
it's a
most
hedge
people
fund for your
happily pay.
agency.
Something like that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's a good way to put it. Um, a lot of people, I guess. So the way you structured your question originally, I think that most people who make the jump are glad they made the jump, but most people will never make the jump. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah,
Like
yeah.
yeah,
Once you decide to get out, right, you're already within a very small population.
yeah, you're kind of built different, and I think particularly uh, there are times and environments in which entrepreneurial type psychology is more favored. You look at a time like the hyper centralized, like the 30s and 40s and 50s. Um, the type of people who be entrepreneurs today who were like, no, I can just go like completely kick ass at one of these corporations or even inside the government because like that's where the talent was going. Talent was extraordinarily centralized. And likewise, I think there are times when, on the frontier, even somebody who would be like, you know, an internal accountant at some giant corporation today would be entrepreneurial out there because there just wasn't any structure for him to snap into. It varies historically. But yeah, I mean, most people want a job.
So to bring this all back to natalism, I think people who are in the predictable spot, who are given that certainty, right? Because most of history, you don't get anywhere near this level of certainty,
Right.
become anti-disposed to having children. I think,
Mhm.
um, because it literally is switching jobs, right? It's at least like
Yeah.
taking a part-time job, getting married. You know, these are very monumental changes, and when you have these monumental changes and you have a kind of background certainty that is just so different from it, um,
Yeah.
do you think that's the major cause? How do you how do you put the odds on that factor?
Well, I think there's a huge number of things happening at once. It's pretty multivariate, but I will say I think it is underrated. It often gets framed in these terms that are like, especially women. This is the accusation that gets levied against women is like, oh, they just want to like eat, pray, love, and they want a girl boss, and like that's why they're not having kids. Um, like it's this very freewheeling, hedonistic excuse not to have kids. I actually think the reverse is true. Having kids is this very risky, chaotic, volatile path to choose in comparison with their other options now.
Absolutely,
We're
yes,
in a
yes.
very controlled, risk averse, very predictable environment. And having kids is a way of aggressively stepping outside that really predictable environment. Essentially, what we are trying to build is a world without love. We're trying to build a world without having your heart outside your body, if that makes sense. Being in love with another person romantically, you're placing a lot of your happiness and peace outside your direct control. And then you do that again when you have kids. You want good things for them and you can't actually make them make the right decisions. So a lot of people are afraid of that, rightly. And I think also as our social scripts become weaker, those decisions become even more volatile, even more risky than they already are. To put it in like direct personal terms, it's like if an attractive, bright young woman is to have a family, you're sort of asking her to stake her most valuable social years. Her 20s are this time of extraordinary opportunity in which she can have all kinds of experiences. She can have all kinds of professional development. She can have all kinds of education. These opportunities are just open to her. You're asking her to take a chance on a man, and frankly to take a chance on the kids, right? That will be this this profound, sort of unspeakable, rewarding experience. She has to kind of believe in magic. She has to believe in like that there's something
Just believe in
ineffable about
divine
that.
providence.
Yeah, she has to believe that something about that experience, in a way she can't predict or describe ahead of time, will be worth it. And it's like the alternative is the job and the vacations and the sort of consumer experience. But like she knows that check will clear. Like she knows she can have that. Whereas this other thing is very kind of ephemeral and, well, just really risky. And so you sort of understand why someone would say, and I don't think actually most women, or even a lot of women, like categorically rule out family. I think what's going on psychologically, if I can mansplain a little bit, is I think what's happening is they're saying like, well, maybe, maybe that magic is possible, but boy, he better be something. He better be really incredible for me to like take that risk. Uh,
Oh, this went a different way than I was expecting.
okay, what were you expecting?
So I've had this experience. I've been like culturally pro-natalist before I was ever adjacent to or like writing about politics.
Yeah,
Um, but I've been in two relationships where this is the thing that both of these ex girlfriends have told me is like we should get married and have kids at the right time.
yeah, yeah,
And I don't know like who knows if that's true and I don't think they're like lying to me kind of maliciously, but I think like most people don't even know this for themselves, right? So
yeah.
they don't even know what their future answer will be, and they're just not willing to make the commitment. And where I thought you were going to say is that they would just like defer it into the future like endlessly, be
That
like, oh,
also,
there'll be
yes.
some time in the future. I don't know when. But they're actually very similar answers, right?
Yeah, they're
There's
almost the
one
same
that's kind of
answer.
deferring on the axis of the quality of the boyfriend, to put it like,
Right.
or the future husband, to put it a bit crudely. And the other is on time, right? So in my situation, we were in long term relationships, we were in happy relationships, but the question is like, but when, right? That was
Yeah.
the axis where there was uncertainty.
Right.
And
Right.
to kind of take the deep dive into philosophy again, I don't know, maybe this is my coping mechanism, but to take the deep dive into philosophy again, I was talking with someone who may be on the podcast soon about another person's book. The book is Freedom from Reality by DC Schindler. And Schindler in this book talks about how Locke invented, and the kind of Lockean society following him kind of invented this idea of like probability, right? He's very critical of this idea of probability at all. And that was kind of what was going through my mind when you were describing this thing of like, oh, it's very risky when a woman is thinking about it, sacrificing for these things that are very uncertain. You kind of have to have the expected value go up. It's a
Right.
very modern way of thinking about things, right? And
Yeah.
Schindler writes in this book, I think, somewhat convincingly, that the ancients we kind of reject this framing altogether with like, it happens or it doesn't happen.
Right.
What do you mean? Like, what do you mean expected value? And maybe that would have made them worse at poker, but might have made them much better at many of these transformational things. Because I think, yeah, when people just apply it, it's just a broken framework. Like, it would be one thing if they were applying these things correctly, and maybe if you're like selling someone life insurance, you kind of are applying it correctly. I believe you when you tell me that women have these narratives go through their mind. In fact, I've experienced this, right? Um, but I don't think they're in any way applying this correctly. Women and men, I should be clear.
Yeah.
Women and men
Yeah.
are not remotely applying this correctly, and maybe it's not even possible to apply it correctly in this context.
Yeah, I don't think it is. Yeah, risk calculus is a sort of bad way to think about this. And
But to your point, it's the only way. It's the default way, at least I should say. It's the
right.
default way to think about this, right?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And one of the images that has occurred to me a lot, Odysseus wanting to hear the sirens. The social structure that we had that has been torn down was the mast to which you were tied. Remember, in that story, like he contrives this situation so that he can hear the music. He's saying, like, I want all of you to plug your ears and let me hear the music. And I think similarly, when we had these guardrails, we were able to sort of give ourselves to the romantic and the erotic in a way that we can't afford to now, or we feel that we can't afford to now. Were those guardrails like perfectly constructed to ensure human flourishing, and were they perfectly just and perfectly fair? No, but they were something. And what we've exchanged them for is nothing. And like that, I think has been a really bad trade.
Yes, and I think it's really important to tell the full story of Odysseus because it is just really important. And I think not all modern people, especially not all young people, know. So Odysseus, he's sailing in this like incredibly treacherous ocean. They know that there are these monsters, these sirens, who will lure you into their trap and essentially crash their ship. And I'm not sure if they're going to eat you or something, but they're going to kill you. The lure is just simply beautiful. And Odysseus, yes, this is an aspect of the story that is actually really important that I didn't pay attention to until probably much later than I should, which is you're exactly right. So his crew they have their ears plugged, but Odysseus he asks to basically have these constraints. Number one, to have the constraints placed upon him at all, right? That's sometimes how the story is told is that he asks to have these constraints placed on him so he can hear the sirens, but he's controlled, right? He's literally tied down. Like he's tied down physically to the ship. And that's how he
Right.
doesn't like jump into the sea and get eaten by these sea monsters. But you're right, there's this very interesting aspect where he doesn't just plug his ears himself, right? He has this experience, this kind of this kind of erotic experience, but only within the confines of like
Yeah.
literally being tied down to the sea. This is an aspect that I really haven't considered before. The Zoomers now, they're not having sex. They're not having relationships at all. I think the story is apt because the thing that conservatives were predicting is that you would just have the summer of love forever. You would just have like rampant infidelity and
Yeah.
licentiousness, and it would just never stop. And that's actually not what happened. It did stop, and it stopped with
Yeah.
these like totally antisocial Zoomers with no Riz, and that's where it stopped. I can identify it in myth, I can identify it in literature, but I have no clue where it comes from. So the big question I have to you is, where does it come from? Why does it become easier to exercise these desires if you have the constraints?
When you ask young people to describe their ideal sort of dating situation, how would they like to meet their spouse, their partner? in general, it takes the shape of quasi arranged marriage, sort of like the modern context of arranged marriage, which is like people who care about me and know me assemble some dossiers of some candidates and they present them to me and I choose from among them. You're not totally alone in the decision. This is certainly true of women, but it's also true of men. Like there's this paradox or maybe a conflict of models between like the manosphere notion of eroticism and how many women describe eroticism, particularly like within marriage. The manosphere thing is trying to explain to you why a woman wants the like bad boy because he's dangerous and he's exciting or whatever it is, juxtaposed with like sort of women in a regular sex life is a stable pairing who will be like, you know, I need to feel safe. I need to feel relaxed. There's a whole other dynamic at play there. And I think it really is about a roller coaster. I want to enjoy the roller coaster, but I need to trust the restraints on the roller coaster, that I'm not going to actually fly off the roller coaster. That's sort of what the Odysseus metaphor describes is like, strap me in and then let me have the experience. I think that's what people are looking for. You can't make it safe, but at least sort of tenable, right? I can tell myself a story why this is going to work out. Almost nobody would frame it in terms of like raw expected value, but just telling themselves like it will be worth it.
No,
Like,
I know people who would frame it in raw expected value.
well, yeah. It's
But
kind of
I
a
know what
weird
you mean.
milieu.
I know what you mean. I'm sure many of them are the same people.
Yeah.
Many of them have been on this podcast. Um, but
Yeah.
aside from those people, I think you're right. We're describing what people want in this modern way, and perhaps it's how modern people would describe it themselves. And so it's truthful in that sense. The thing that you're actually describing is like having the hand of God over you, right?
Yeah.
Um the thing that you're describing isn't having like a thing that people will say in Burning Man is that they'll say like nothing leaves Burning Man, right? This will have no impact on the rest of my life. And,
Mm.
maybe that's true financially, maybe it's not going to directly impact their job. Maybe it's not going to directly impact, you know, um, and anything else.
That's a crazy
But
thing to believe, but
you
okay.
yourself are going to be changed, right? And I think,
Yeah.
especially if we're talking about intimate experiences, um, that's inevitable. You go there, you take the ayahuasca, it completely like breaks your brain. You like
Right.
almost belong in a mental asylum now. Other than that, everything else is
Yeah.
unchanged. It
Yeah.
is this like
No,
it
it
is a kind
does.
of Shakespearean tale. Go on.
Totally. Well, it does. It would almost be better in the big picture if
Go.
what that did to you was to make you like a gibbering, like clearly belongs in a straitjacket in a mental hospital, like
Like
crazy
you just go to
person.
Burning Man and they just give you the lobotomy.
Right. Because then, the disease like couldn't spread. But what it does is it like refactors your brain in ways where like you're still good at your job, you can still attract mates, but like you're all scrambled up inside and completely deranged. And I've met a lot of these people, and their new worldview is totally internally consistent, and it's totally unassailable from the outside, and it's totally deranged. And you're almost building this parallel reality of like that kind of person. And they tend to be smart people, and they tend to be, high status people. And I think it's like really bad for society.
Yeah, it's just a fly trap. It's just luring more
Yeah.
people in.
Yeah.
The sirens, the mistake is that they just like killed everyone, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
They'd do better. They
Yeah.
should set up like an MLM marketing scheme. They should have some of the people go out and be drones. So this was a question that I wanted to ask about, but before I got on the Burning Man tangent. When people are thinking about these things, they kind of want this idea of safety, and it's not the same idea of safety as the ancients had, of like the hand of God watching over you. It's an
Yeah.
idea of safety of like you're almost like in a time loop, right? And
Yeah.
nothing ever happens to you, nothing leaves Burning Man. And like I kind of don't understand the person who's satisfied with that. And like, first of all, have you ever seen anyone who's actually satisfied by that? Because I don't think I have.
Can well, so can you say more about what you mean exactly?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it goes back to the kind of Schindler thing of inventing probabilities, but it's maybe even more simple than that, which is it's the Burning Man attitude, or the pre-Burning Man attitude of nothing leaves Burning Man. The idea that people want is not that things will necessarily become better even, but just that they will be completely predictable and stay the same and be completely mechanistic, like an API, like buying something from Amazon, right? You go to Burning Man, you have these experiences, but they're in like a purely packaged form that leaves you completely unchanged and gives you a
Yeah.
completely predictable version of your personality in the future. And I think that not only is that completely discontinuous with ancient conceptions of safety, it's discontinuous with conceptions of safety up until, at least World War II, probably a bit after. It just happened very recently, and it's this like completely deranged belief that if you like ask a Roman about this, they would just have like no conception of.
Yeah, I think that definitely like there's a particular set of like temperamentally, naturally computer brained people who have flooded toward the money, right? There's just a lot of money that's available to computer brained people that was not available to them, 100 years ago. Those people have formed a society that makes sense. But
Yes.
I think it's a mistake to view what they're doing or their perception of what they're doing as like actually a good and happy way to live. I think most of them are pretty unhappy. Their self conception of what they're doing is like, no, actually, life is just sort of unhappy. And what I am doing is sort of optimal within the constraints of what life is. They sort of view religious people as sort of retarded, but they're like, I kind of wish I could be that flavor of retarded. Like, like that might be nice, at least to try on. And I don't think it's like something that they feel really headstrong
But
about.
even that is already a very deranged sentiment, right? Like trying on a religion.
Right. Oh yeah.
The rabbit hole
Yeah.
that we just keep digging deeper into the cave below Plato's cave. Speed running, the whole thing. Speed running. That can be the subhead. The title for this episode, it can be Kevin Dolan speed running the cave below Plato's cave. Um, that's
Yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah.
that's really like
Or like, how can we adopt this social technology? How can we synthesize a
yes, I
religion? How can
fucking
we
hate that term. I think for the same reasons I heard you talk about this before, but I think for the same reasons that you say, which is like if you're using the term, you're like 100% guaranteed to be like doing the wrong thing.
Yeah, I mean, you cannot under any circumstances make yourself believe something you don't believe. And the only way that you can even talk about that is in the context of planning to lie to other people. Like, it's not that I'm going to believe it. I might make somebody else believe it. People see what you're doing. They can smell it on you. Um,
So what do you make of Jordan Peterson? Is he just trying to make other people believe it? And he always has this line of I act like I believe in God, right? That's what Jordan says.
yeah.
And I think he, to the best of his ability, seems to do that. And but I guess in some ways he kind of proves your point, right? Because then he says, "But I can't make myself believe it," right?
Yeah, which that to me is honest. I respect that. Yeah,
And
I think he's kind of a
yeah,
tragic figure, at least in my mind. But I don't think he's a bad guy. I don't think he's a bad actor. He's lying. I think he's in his own way a little bit, but that's
yeah,
aren't we all?
Peterson is almost the figure of, I forget this person's name, the first like Catholic convert in the New World. This this guy basically is this Native American who converts to Catholicism, and there's this testimony from him where he's just like, all of my people, what will happen to them? They've been raised this way my entire life. What happens to people who either never heard the word or never really stood a shot, right? Were completely raised, you could say indoctrinated if you want, in this heretical view of life. And a lot of the time the answer is just tragedy, right? And yeah, I think that it's interesting to see Peterson in that way, right? As someone who has grown up in the kind of psychology, social science, atheist adjacent milieu, and because of that, like, just can't quite make his way to a conversion. How do you think the
Yeah,
story will end? Does he convert in the end?
I mean, who knows? I wouldn't even
Does he convert
try
to
to.
LDS in the end?
Well, don't we all in the end? No, I mean, I am. I think God's mercy is pretty expansive. If more chances will help, you probably get more chances. That's my view of the matter. And yeah, only God knows, right? I think.
Indeed.
I mean, certainly with his case in particular, but even in the general case, I think only God knows.
In some ways, everything that we're talking about is some version of conversion, right? It's some version of a fundamental reorientation
Yes.
of your way of life and of your belief and of your fundamental values. You are going to have a different outlook, and being in love, right? You described it earlier. It's the same thing. All of these things, they're kind of undescribable for this exact reason, because all of
Yeah.
these things are transformational. This is my big question to the pronatalist movement, because just to lay my cards on the table here, I think it's almost all like just the problem of transformations. If you have a society where transformations are, tolerable to the majority, then the majority will have kids, the majority will make transformational choices, the majority will believe. I personally think that they will be Baptist Protestants, but the majority will believe. So I have an essay coming up. I want to release it before the conference, of like why I'm not a pronatalist, is that I just don't believe in subsidies or social policies, or
Yeah.
like almost all of the things that are proposed by pronatalists, because I think it is just like a regime change complete problem. It is just and a specific regime change towards a society where like people can have the transformations, and that this is good and moral and promoted by like basically by like everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I basically
So
agree.
first of all, uh oh, okay. Is there anything on the horizon that can actually move us towards a transformational society?
Well, it's funny. I've had like three people submit their uh, talks for the conference uh, that include the phrase "Why I'm not a pronatalist."
Amazing.
But
You're
the
the
fact is,
anti-pronatalist club.
right,
Yeah,
right, right, right.
yeah.
Yeah, it's and when it's described in terms of like we need to tweak the incentives, we need to like throw more kibble at the pandas so they'll breed, like that. I find both aesthetically revolting and also guaranteed to be ineffective. It is about people taking a leap. It's interesting the way that conservatives will often frame this, and part of the challenge with like pronatalism and like the sort of birth rate crisis thing is that it's always framed in terms of like the society is on the verge of collapse, and therefore you as an individual need to take a colossal risk to save it. And that I think is backwards and silly, because this thing is not sustainable. The wheels are falling off. That's the way to talk about the crisis. It's not to say like, oh, this crisis is coming and therefore you must do your part to save like liberal Western democracies' pension funds. Like, that's asinine. This crisis is coming. And what I want to do is I want to take the people who want to make it through that bottleneck and help them. I want to bring those people together who either who are already amenable to this kind of transformative, irrational, spiritual decision. And I want to get them together and help them help each other. To the extent that policy is even a factor, it's like, how does policy help that happen? How does policy help bring whatever is survivable through that bottleneck? How do I save as much of what I think is beautiful and meaningful in the face of this calamity? It's not about stopping the calamity, because like a lot of it's baked in. Are there things you can do about a hurricane? Yes, but like, you're gonna have a hurricane.
Yeah, I think that's a healthy way to think about it. Yeah, I do think the messianism comes from two things, right? There are specific people who are kind of like Bay Area rationalist, effective altruism adjacent. And there's just a tendency of the modern times, right? That like all political problems are collective action problems, even if they're actually like discernment problems.
Yeah.
Um, the class of political discernment problem is just something that has been completely forgotten. I think maybe you can talk about it if you're like hating on the rich, right? You can say like, oh, we shouldn't be giving like social security to the rich because they don't need it, which is actually kind of fair. But it can only be framed in like, if we have the dying traces of it, right? We have the dying traces of political discernment problems. Whereas, it was a fundamental question to Plato, to Aristotle, of like, how do you discern an elite? How do you cultivate an elite? How do you like determine roles in a society? What should you honor? What kind of way of life should you pursue? All these questions um, are political discernment questions. And to, I think, many modern people, they just have literally no zero conception of this, right?
Right, right. They assume that
And
those questions are answered.
yeah, so I think on one hand you are partially right in that, like, the birth rate collapse is just going to happen. There's going to be declining, global populations. It's just going to happen. And no matter what you do, there will be declining global populations. And probably a lot of the stuff that happens in like Korea and Taiwan and Singapore, um, probably nothing you can do.
Sure.
On the other hand, why I definitely say like what we can do in terms of a transformational society, and I don't necessarily mean in terms of policy, in terms of using the government. Um, but the reason why I say that is I think that on a conceptual level, like none of these things exist anymore unless you're like a
None of what
classic
things?
scholar or a Straussian or a historian. Like, you just you are not even thinking about these things. I want to cash this a little bit, but I almost worry that the cure will be worse than disease. That a lot of the things that people will do, let's say like China, right? If China does forced insemination, we can all criticize China.
Yeah.
I think that creates like a very authoritarian and like basically unlivable circumstance for like everyone in
Like,
China.
what's interesting about that to me is that people talk endlessly about China's like state capacity and the fact that they were able to like weld people inside their apartments and just sort of get away with shit that like no one here would ever get away with. It is surprising to me that they haven't taken like the type of authoritarian measures that you're describing already, because like in order for them to forestall or not have a substantial demographic crisis in the 2030s, they would have had to do stuff like that 10 years ago. And they can't do it now. It's baked in. You have to believe that either A, they just don't get what's going to happen in terms of the demographic consequences, or B, they actually don't have the kind of coercive power to make that happen, or C, which I think is probably the most likely answer, I think they are going all in on replacing their workforce with humanoid robots. I think that they are going to try to race to replace themselves with robots. I don't think they're going to try forced insemination. I think if they were going to do that, they would have had to already do it.
I kind of agree with three. Uh, I don't really think it's likely. Like, I've seen the Unitree demos; they're not actually very impressive at all. But
Yeah.
one additional political consideration, I haven't fact checked this, but a friend, I think maybe a mutual friend, told me this, that it's like explicit CCP doctrine that like aging societies are more docile, and so we should embrace an aging society so that it is more docile and does not regime change us.
I think that's wildly optimistic because like ultimately, but yes, that's interesting
Like
in
you
terms of
look
this
at the
frame
aging
of,
societies, right? Even like aging, like quote unquote authoritarian countries. That's like that's true.
well, what's interesting about that to me in particular is going back to this framing of the state expanding to scale and what it regards as the pathogens, what it's having an immune response to. If you're thinking of the threats being uh, some other polity, then like an aging society, you obviously straightforwardly don't want that. That makes no sense. That's almost all downside. But if you're thinking of the threat as being like, yeah, your own people, then yeah, maybe you want your own people to be kind of weak and tired and old and sick.
What are some of the reasons why people are who are going to the pronatalist conference, other than myself, are not pronatalists?
I think broadly, it's the kind of uh, critiques that we've already described, just like the sort of spreadsheet brain mentality, the idea that secular Western liberalism is going to be saved. Like, she belongs to the streets. She don't want to be saved. That I
Yeah,
think is,
yeah.
is the primary objection.
There are these two trends that I think are really interesting, which both relate to the kind of return of discernment and really the end of universalism. Is number one, we're like as a society, like American society is sick of the savior complex people. They're sick of the Sam Bankman-Frieds and the effective altruists and the Gretas and like all of these people. We've just had enough. And the other
Yeah.
thing is artistic, is that I think in a lot of the horror that we're making, like an Ari Aster movie, for example, right? I think that we're getting classical comedy coming back. And what I mean by that is like, the Divine Comedy, the famous work by Dante, is it's not particularly funny, right? It's not supposed to be funny. That's not what he means by comedy. What he means by comedy is that people are getting their just desserts. People are
Yeah.
getting what they deserve, and implicit in that, of course, is that there is such a thing as people who deserve punishment. There is such a thing as hell, and there is such a thing as people who go to hell.
Yeah.
And that, I think, has been an idea that emotionally has been very anathema to people. The kind of fire and brimstone, high discernment culture that that there really is a kind of decadence and a fall and a transformation in a negative way of your soul. And
Mm.
that's an idea that's lost out in the same time that universalism has become so popular. And you can see why, right? These are very clearly kind of ideologically linked of, oh, if you believe in a kind of not just a universal savior in Christ that, still requires you to be saved by grace, but and choose to importantly choose to be saved by grace, but a kind of just like universalism where there's no evil, there's nothing wrong, there are no people who do evil. We're born free, yet everywhere we're in chains. Human nature
Yeah.
is just a good. Then you need to erase those aspects of arts and culture and of reality, really.
Right.
And why I think this relates is that people, the comedy is coming back, the universalism is falling, and people are becoming more comfortable with the idea that some people are just not going to make it. Maybe it's to heaven, maybe it's to the weird, superhuman descendant world of of 2200. Um
Mm.
but the idea that some people are just not going to make it. And I think that philosophically, that's a wonderful development. And I think that, yeah, this is something that I've really changed my mind on, because the kind of like Trump border reaction, right? Trump won reaction to the border, kids in cages, all of that. I think that's just done. Like,
Yeah.
people, even libs care more about Elon and Doge and like hating capitalists.
Yeah.
And maybe that last part isn't good, but like that they've gotten over the unconditional bleeding heart emotionalism. That is just, I didn't think they could do it, but they did. It's amazing. It's amazing to see that CNN hosts like ask a Democratic representative, and they're like, "Yeah, we should do the deportations." And maybe they'll say, "But Elon's an oligarch," and so on and so forth. But like, just to have them say we should do the deportations, it is just such a like. This is a thing. I am too much of a modern. I am too much of a person who doesn't believe in transformations, because like this was just a total fucking shock to me.
Yeah. Yeah. They're certainly pivoting away from the hysteria, the shrieking. It's
But
much
like
more
even
brass
that,
tack.
the idea that you can like pivot away from this, I'm not sure that's right. Like I know a lot of libs, many of them, I assure you, are good people. And I knew a lot of people who are like deeply emotionally attached to the deportations issue, and even among many of the people I know, they're just like, meh. Maybe I'm just like, I'm just shocked by this happening. But maybe we can have more of a transformational society sooner than we thought. Maybe that's the takeaway. But
I think that's the case. I think I'm trying to figure out is like how bad do things have to get before that transformation happens? I think it's almost always the question, whether it's your personal life or whether it's the fate of nations. It's like, how bad does this have to hurt before you make a change? I think that answer varies for different people. I want to get the people together who are already ready to respond to that pain, ready to respond to that invitation to change. It's not about excluding or you're not invited if you're not problem aware, but like you just won't come if you're not problem aware.
yeah, it's like I just showed up to this conference to spend an entire day listening to these people talk about something I care nothing about.
Right.
It's
Right.
very hard. What's the first step? What's the first step out of Plato's cave?
You mean in terms of like, uh,
Yeah, like the crisis or some kind of crisis happens, it gets bad enough, and people like really fundamentally change their behavior. What do they do? What's the
well,
first thing they do?
there's the age at which your attitude toward dating changes, just like what you're looking for from your romantic life. I think that's one big mindset shift. Like, are you trying to get married and have babies, or are you trying to explore your sexuality or whatever? um that's a big one. And then like if you are, I mean, one of the biggest awakenings that I think is even maybe even less common than a woman in her 30s realizes she actually wants kids is families with kids realizing like, oh, I don't have a generalizable solution that I can tell my kids. Like, I don't know how dating works in this new insane environment. I'm not going to be able to just like boomer my way through this and farm them out to whatever institutions are responsible for acculturating children these days. I got to take some steps to ensure that my kids are educated and acculturated in a way that makes them not just sort of economically productive, but socially desirable to the opposite sex. And I need to make sure that they're surrounded by mentors and just admirable people of the type that I would want my grandkids to be like. If you want to know what your kids will be like, they're going to be a lot like your spouse, right? Like, and so you should choose your spouse on the basis of uh, what you. I mean, you don't, you should, whatever. Like, but people should think
No,
about.
we encourage that on this podcast. We encourage the normative judgments. Yes, people should choose their kids based on how they want their children to, or their spouse based on how their kids to turn out. But
Yeah,
go on, go on.
yeah. So
I will endorse that statement. But sorry, go
all
on.
right, all right, all right. If you want to know what your grandkids are going to be like, assuming you're going to have grandkids, uh, they're going to be like your tribe. They're going to be like the people that your kids grow up around and consume the same media as, and are involved in the same activities as, and the children of their mentors, the children of your professional and social connections, assuming you don't just sort of give them up to the monoculture, just send them off to be educated and raised by somebody else. So like that's a huge part of it. Your original question. Your original question was like, where's the awakening? And I think
Yeah,
both of those are really significant. The A, like, how am I going to raise a family? Like, it's not guaranteed that I get to do that. And then B, it's not actually guaranteed that I get to have grandkids and my line gets to continue. So like, how do I think about that?
yeah, it's really interesting. I'll just kind of speak to my process about this, which is I think I probably got a lot more selective after kind of being in the loop with the pronatalist. I got a lot more selective and especially wary of like heritable mental illness. And in hindsight, I realized I was probably bad. That was probably a period when I was being too selective, and quite frankly, that I ended relationships that I should not have ended.
Mm, yeah.
And I
not to get too
also went
personal, but
through
like, not to get too personal, but like, can you be more specific about what types of mental illness you were concerned about?
I was too concerned. I kind of have a type of like girls with anxiety disorders, which is like a
Mm-hmm.
lot of Zoomer girls.
Yeah, that's
But
just life. Yeah. Now.
yeah, that kind of is just life. You're right. But there was a time, this would have been after the major breakup, which was kind of related to the same factors. But there was a time when like I would just like go down the DSM, and I would like if like I would just like be very wary of like any women with anxiety disorders, which if you've seen like the charts is somewhere between 30 and 60% of Zoomer women.
Right,
Kind of a
right, right.
problem. Um
Well, the reason that I asked you to be specific is I think that there is this very strong failure in the framework of a lot of these, like, I guess what I would say is like pop eugenicists. um,
many such cases. I'm sure
many,
several of
many,
them have been in the podcast.
many
Some are
such
good
cases.
people. I'm gonna
Some,
keep
I
saying that. In
assume.
fact, yeah.
Yeah.
But
Um,
sorry,
the, the
but they are flawed people, and how are they flawed?
well, no, the mistake they're making, I think, in a lot of cases, is they're being Darwinian about profoundly unnatural short term circumstances. Like
Yes.
like the situation that we are in is completely deranged. The way we're being asked to live is completely deranged. And to say someone who doesn't handle that well is life unworthy of life, that they like shouldn't make it, I think that's a huge mistake. It's a huge mistake. That's another sort of critique that we get, especially from like the hit pieces, is these guys are eugenicists. And I'm like, it's better to have kids with someone who uh, you admire and you want them to be like, and who's healthy and who you think smells good. But I think this like facile, grug brained eugenics where it's like they've got this and that problem right here and now, I think it's a huge mistake. Because a lot of these people, like, what I would be thinking about is like, what were their great grandparents like? Were their great grandparents pretty well adjusted, normal, healthy, happy people? Then they're probably fine, right? It's the situation that's screwed up. Libs think everything is environment, and like that's their mistake. But a lot of the tech right thinks everything is genetics, and it's like it's really not, man. Like there's a lot that can change. There's a lot of there are a lot of psychological situations or psychological architecture that has made it this far for a reason, even if it sort of leads to suboptimal outcomes under our present condition. Have you heard Scott Alexander's, or have you read his post about schizophrenia versus autism?
No.
It's really good. Basically, he frames them up as disorders of pattern matching. That schizophrenics have their like salience detector tuned way up so that everything is salient, everything has meaning, everything's connected. Autism, by contrast, is like assume nothing. Like everything must be first principles, nothing's related, nothing's connected unless I can explicitly uh, prove out the connection. And so that sort of connects all sorts of components of an autism diagnosis, like yes, the difficulty of reading faces is like, if I'm looking at your face, I don't have like this intuitive repository of other expressions that I can connect it to and say like, oh, this person's bored that I'm talking too much, or this person is offended that I've said this and that, and I should think about how I've offended them. Or even things like the tag in the back. Like a lot of people with autism have like sensory things. Like I don't like having a tag in the back of my shirt. And it's because if you have sort of a standard neurotypical pattern matcher, then you're like, your brain just goes like, oh, that's normal. I can filter that out of the data. I don't notice that anymore. Whereas if you have autism, it's like it's always new. It's always this novel stimulus that's distracting. Also, tolerance for loud noises and crosstalk, things like that. The reason I bring that up in this circumstance is that spectrum. There's not an optimal on that spectrum. There's a typical, but like people whose pattern matcher, people who are more prone to like false negatives are valuable in all sorts of circumstances. And people who are prone to false positives are valuable in all sorts of circumstances. And like you need all of that. I just think there's an extreme tendency to pathologize things that are within the ambit of, you know, normal humanity, and certainly people who are valuable to know and valuable to date and people who should keep on existing in the next, generation.
Yeah. This is another thing that I've sort of grown to realize is that I don't like taking care of people, or I don't like taking care of people in a very um persistent way. You know, here's what I mean by that. If someone, especially someone who I care a lot about, has like the flu, that's a situation where I'm like very happy to take care of them, and then the flu goes away, and
Yeah.
problem solved.
Yeah.
And a lot of relationships are just not like that. They're these continuous, eternal things. You never get a problem solved. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
you're I'm sure you know this much better than I do, but that's just kind of what happens. It took me a long time to to even accept this as a reality at all. I think at this
Yeah.
point I've like accepted it as a reality. I'm on the stage where I'm still like figuring out, what to deal with this and how much of it I can take. The spirit of the age where it's a very short-termist kind of thing, right?
Mhm.
It's certainly not looking at the longitudinal environment that you're going to be growing up with. It's also looking very narrowly in at the interactions that you have with someone or that they have with the world,
Mhm.
right? And it does seem like something where I feel like if I was growing up in ancient Greece or something, I would have learned this a little bit sooner.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is a real stumbling block or a real struggle for singles, particularly today, maybe always though, I don't know how different this has ever been, is just the recognition that like your life is going to have unsolved problems. Like your life is just going to have some open-ended long-term challenges that don't go away, and some of those are going to involve your spouse. Like that's that's always true. Most love ends in, well, all love ends in sorrow, right? Because somebody dies, somebody gets
Death
sick.
takes us all.
Yeah. So and
Even Brian Johnson.
even Brian Johnson, assuming that you have a happy lifelong marriage, the odds that you're going to be involved in long-term caretaking for your spouse is about 50%, right? Because it's either going to be you or them. You want someone who has challenges that uh, you are built to address. Like, like there are people for whom like emotional challenges are really difficult for them to deal with, and there are people who have a lot of emotional challenges, right? And so like that's probably not a great fit, right? You should probably find somebody who has higher conscientiousness, lower neuroticism, and and other challenges that you'll have to deal with. But you're always going to be dealing with sort of the crooked timber of humanity there, and your kids are going to be flawed too. Like they're gonna they're gonna have uh, they're not going to fulfill all of your sort of vicarious fantasies, right? They're going to be people, just regular people. Now, when you're talking about heritable illness, what I think should go in the pot is not like, oh, I want to create a superhuman. But what should maybe go in the pot is like, these kids are going to be real human beings that I care about intensely.
Yeah, I mean,
And
this is a question that I have asked an ex of like, you know, we should really be worried about our children killing themselves. So I think it is a lot more practical than just the kind of eugenics aspect.
yeah, well, and obviously it
Even
always
though I
depends
agree
on
with
the
the broader
intensity,
critique.
right? It always depends on the intensity, right? Like there are people for whom just the idea of them being emotionally stable enough to raise a family is like in question. I think you're right that the tendency to universalize and the tendency to look for uh, look for universally applicable heuristics and algorithms to like define these questions is misguided. When I say that, I'm running this conference and I'm pro-natalist, I am not saying like everyone must do X, Y, and Z, in this particular way. It's saying directionally, people should have kids. People should raise families and they should fall in love and they should. It's much less categorical. It's not the spreadsheet brained version of the argument.
This is a development within people I know. within the kind of like crazy people who have came on this podcast to talk to me and who I know in real life and who work in tech or politics, whatever. Of the people I know, this has been very exciting to me. Of a much less kind of spreadsheet brained, much more like literary, transformative outlook on life. This has just been
Yeah.
something that's been really exciting for me to watch. At least kind of feel like that I've been vindicated on. But
I think that I think that actually the technology is going to help us on that. I
oh,
think that
absolutely, yes,
I think that AI clogging all of our scaled communication systems with slop and fake news and the inability to discern anything that's being transmitted through these giant scaled communication systems. I don't think those communication systems or communication channels were ever honest or were ever delivering truth. And so I think that it's good for the deceit to be visible and obvious to everyone because that generates skepticism of exactly this kind of thinking. Like we looked at the data and the data said, because statistics is always kind of bunk. Like there's always, you should always have an asterisk next to anything that you're studying in this like massively aggregated way. And we sort
yeah.
of got,
Bezos, the new MAGA convert Bezos has this line of like, if the anecdote disagree with statistics, then you're probably measuring the statistic wrong, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. And there's a version of that. It's like, well, we just need to be more and more and more and more accurate, right? Like we just haven't made it legible enough yet. Um, but
Many such cases still.
I think we're headed the other way. I think we're headed toward reenchantment. I think we're headed toward talking to God, and that's going to be a really positive thing. People uh, trusting their gut, trusting what they see and what they experience over what somebody on a screen tells them.
I mean, you're really preaching to the choir here. We've invented. Have you ever watched Dune or read the
Sure.
books?
Yeah.
So there, it's for the audience. They're this like class of people in Dune, which is a world where they invented the AIs and then banned the AIs. There's a class of people called the Mentats who do all of the jobs the AIs were supposed to do. They like multiply the numbers, they do the spreadsheets. Um, and those people exist because they banned the machines and they're trying to replace the machines. The great irony of the present day is that we invented the mentats before we invented the thinking machines. We had all of like these spreadsheet brained people, all of these like spreadsheet brained monotonous jobs. Like we have accountants. Accountants should just be software programs. But we have this role known as an accountant. And we've invented it long before we actually had the software necessary. So we've just been like, quite frankly, like in my opinion, just like we just tortured some folks. We had them do it. Um, and now you can finally be liberated. You can finally be free of your like stupid mentat job.
Yeah. I'm Dr. Bennett on Twitter, and I had a joke that the Benettian jihad is you shall not make a human mind in the likeness of a machine.
Yes, exactly.
Because that's what we did. That's what we did. We did it
Yes, and we are
backwards.
we are still doing it. We're doing it. Um, I actually think in a lot of the world we'll be doing it more and more. I think that's the current epicycle is that we'll use the machines to make humans more and more like machines. Um, kind of like the people who like take the chess engine feedback and use it to be better at chess, right? I
Yeah.
mean those people I'm not actually against. I think that they can do that with their free time, have fun. Um,
Sure.
Hopefully they have fun. But I think that entire class of jobs, um, I think both like the people doing them will be happy that they stop existing, and like
Yes.
society as a whole will be happy that they stop existing. I think like
Yes.
the, of all of the waves of automation, this is probably the actually like the single most pro social one for exactly this
Yes.
reason that we've invented the mentats first.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. If a machine can do it, a machine should do it. Yeah, because you're not a machine, you know? And
Yes, you have a
and
soul, you have a will, you have taste.
right, and I think that the doomers on that sort of they reveal, I think, a lack of belief that humans are anything other than compute. Like we're just sort of inadequate computers. We're suboptimal computers,
Yeah, I
and
think they'll
therefore we're
say
going to be
this.
replaced by better computers. And I think that's just absolutely wrongheaded, just uh, completely wrong about what humans are.
I have this line that's like, every AI safety thought experiment is a real rationalist social problem, right?
Yeah.
Like the paperclip optimizer is like an interaction that they've had with like someone else in a rationalist group house, right? Is that like they just know one person who just like really likes paperclips and just collects them, and he's like, oh fuck, this could happen if we build an AI.
Yeah, yeah. If only this guy had like a couple more terabytes of compute, he
Yeah,
could take over the
and they'll be
world.
like, "Oh man, this is like the smartest guy I know," and he's just like collecting all of these fucking paper clips. What if our machines wanted to do that? Oh fuck.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
This one, I'm not sure if this one is how it originated, but a few of them do originate this way. Like this is not like purely a joke. It's like kind of
Yeah,
a joke,
I met a weird guy.
but only kind of.
And
Yeah,
what if
I
that
met a
guy were
weird
way
guy.
smarter?
Yeah.
That's terrific. Yeah, no, but I am pro AI both for the sort of transformative outcomes in terms of economics and changing the way we work and the way we think about each other, but also, yeah, the fact that it will put paid to essentially managerial epistemology, the idea of trusting the science, getting your knowledge about the world out of a pipe. I think that's really a valuable development.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in some ways AIs do solve some of these like statistical problems. Take like Palantir. Palantir, I think, has like a very early machine learning algorithm to like detect objects, to like aim stuff, right? That's in some ways that's like statistical, that's like actuarial, right? It also works. It's also doing an actual productive thing. And then you have what Strauss describes of like people just like cutting up the worm in social science and cutting up the worm into such a narrow slice that it tells you nothing about the whole. And so you're just not gaining any information. And of course, he's not just describing biology, but he's more specifically describing political science, where people are not concerned with the overall regime. They're not concerned with the virtue and the nature of what is right. They're in some ways, not even really concerned with the survival of the regime, which is would be shocking to someone like Machiavelli. Um, but everything is kind of instrumentalized, sliced up, oversimplified, um, totally like turned into a toy, and it is just disastrous. There's this amazing article by Jacob Siegel called Data Driven Defeat about how, with the access of Palantir, and with the access of a Palantir tool that I should say was doing its job and was functioning, it created a kind of incentive structure where commanders were more able to justify their actions based on, quote unquote data, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
these are actions that are not actually justified. Just look at the outcome of the war. Just look at the outcome of, I believe, Afghanistan. We're not justified. And actually, that there would be, if you were to collect it, some amount of data to justify it. But the thing with a managerial structure is that it's never actually fair. Right? I shouldn't say never. Right? Like there are versions of it that function. Right? But that very often this kind of, the more you have to insist on it being like really data driven, the more you kind of get the suspicion that like actually it's cherry picked and actually it's like
right,
completely selective and there's something else going on here.
right. Yeah, and I mean, there's just sort of two problems there. One of which is that, yeah, what you're trying to measure is just way more uh, dimensionally complex than you're sort of accounting for. But there's also the fact that like you are building a structure in which human beings are expected to behave like organelles, and they're not actually organelles. They have their own incentives and will and desires. That's sort of where egregores come from, right? That's the sort of what an egregore is it's an agglomeration of individuals acting according to their incentives. It's like trying to hammer human beings into like a eusocial hive like system, and
Yeah, the
it's
new Soviet
it's
man, you know.
yeah, it's failing.
All of this returns us to the question I asked earlier, which I think you gave a good answer to, but I think we can keep talking about, which is what happens after the transformation? What happens after the regime change? First of all, people will find kids. Or sorry, people will have kids. They will find partners. They will fall in
Sure.
love. Amazing things will happen, and I certainly hope that's the case. But maybe more related to Exit Group, David Kilcullen's book, which I haven't read the book, but I've listened to your review of the book. Great review.
Oh, thank you.
Um, and yeah, I think there's going to be. I think it's very likely going to be a scenario, no matter how the transformation happens, that there will be like an ancien regime that will lack the ability to perpetuate itself in the long term,
Hmm.
but will have the ability just to like destroy things with nuclear
Sure.
weapons, kind of like a proto Russia, right? Russia, like maybe they can take over Ukraine. They definitely can't take over Europe. They definitely can't take over America, but they
Right.
can also start nuclear war, right?
I think Russia is a very interesting model to look at, um, especially in terms of the post-Soviet collapse. I think that alternative sovereignties, like this is one of the reasons that I like biology's work so much. Alternative sovereignties are going to emerge, right? And the question is, who are those people going to be, and what will your relationship be to them? And uh, how do you make sure that you show up on time to that party? How do you make sure that you're not early to that party? And that's a hugely important question. What they say in investing, like early is the same as wrong. So with exit, what I'm trying to do is surround myself with and be as useful as I can be to as many admirable and excellent and values aligned people as I can find. Creating conditions in which we have increasing leverage over these sort of faceless managerial systems of control, and utilizing our advantage as human beings, which is our ability to see things and maneuver in ways that those managerial systems are not built to perceive or respond to. Like there are certain categories of challenge, of resistance, of threat that our system of control is very well equipped to handle and stamp out. Um, there are others which it is completely blind to. There are places you can go and positions you can put yourself in where you are way more practically free than you would otherwise be. Part of what's happened is that the system of control that we live in right now is totally a product of like deception, like just sort of power routing around the rules that were intended to contain it. And so it's a lot of kludges, it's a lot of duct tape and baling wire and bubble gum running these systems of control, because they have to be, they were built to route around attempts to contain them. So for
This is really
instance,
important. What's an example of this?
so an example of this is your HR department. So your HR department at your job exists to prevent the company from being the target of a lawsuit, right? When Trump was first elected, there was like a wave of companies saying they were going to get rid of their DEI department or whatever. And that was cheered as like, oh, woke is over. We won. We beat them. No, the system of control that exists in your corporate environment is as strong as it ever was. They changed the names, they changed the labels, whatever. Doesn't matter. Maybe they pared down some of the like do nothing sinecures, but like HR is actually like an important overhead center, and like it does an important business purpose, which is to not get sued. Accounting is so you don't get audited and have the tax man on your ass. Legal is for external lawsuits. HR is for internal lawsuits. And the reason that HR exists is because we have a series of laws where, in particular, there's disparate impact and there's hostile work environment. So somebody on Elon's production line in California got called the N-word by another black person, and that led to a $137 million lawsuit. It's like the government is putting out bounties for essentially socially undesirable thought and behavior. And they're saying, if you can find a problem in this company, we'll pay you $137 million. And so what happens when people find those problems? They find them everywhere. Not only that, they are trained over like decades to like be hypersensitive because there's so much reward if you find one. And so that's obviously like socially really bad. But like in terms of the power structure, we would have one set of problems if we lived in Cuba or North Korea or even China or Russia, where like if I say the wrong thing, police will come to my house, they will take me to jail, I will be tried by a judge, I'll be told you're not allowed to say that, and they'll put me in jail or cane me or whatever. Our system is if you say these things, you don't get to have health insurance. You don't get to earn a regular living. Because we've made it so that these high status jobs require you to assent to the set of propositions, we've made it so that those positions are like inherently low status. Disagreeing with those positions is inherently low status. And so it is not just a cultural phenomenon or some like fever that we all suffered and now it's past. It's like it's infrastructural. It's part of our institutions. And the way doxing works is I think an interesting illustration of this, because it is actually not the case that like someone like Jason Wilson writes this piece about how you're a bad person and then everyone gets angry and like online there's a wave of popular outrage, and then your HR department is like, oh, we can't handle the PR consequences of this. It's too hot for our marketing strategy. Like that's not how it works at all. If you read these doxes, they're very like dull to read. They're not intended to be like popularized to sort of generate popular outrage. It's like a dossier. It's like an intelligence dossier of he said this, and this. These are all specifically like actionable, discriminatory things he said, so that someone can call your HR department and say like, this guy is basically a hostile work environment lawsuit waiting to happen. So that becomes basically what they've done through the creation of just a handful of legal constructs. They have made it so that every corporation with over 100 employees has had to like hire their own secret police, their own like internal political security forces to ensure that like, and they have to, and like, it's not just that like there's this explicit set of rules you must follow. It's like your HR department needs to be crazier than the craziest person at your job. Like they need to be able to anticipate that insanity so that they can make sure nobody offends that insanity. And so all of this is to say that is a very powerful enforcement mechanism. But if you can get outside the W 2, if you can get outside of corporate employment, you basically go back to having free speech. You are free to speak your mind because they can't take away your health insurance. They can't. If it worked the way they claim it does, which is like, oh, people got mad at you, then like the guy who runs a window tinting business would not be able to speak his mind because he would offend his customers, right? But that's not who's offended. That's not the issue. It's like this big boulder rolling downhill, and like it will smash you flat, smash you into a pulp if you stay there. But if you just step aside, you're completely fine. And like that's the nature of these managerial systems. They have these specific channels through which they are equipped to target power and equipped to perceive and acquire threats. But you can just end run them. And like states are doing this too. I mean, the Chinese, if you look at the way they've interacted with the United States over the last 20 years, they're clearly practicing what the book described as unrestricted warfare. Are you familiar with this book?
Yes, Unrestricted
Okay.
Warfare, great book.
Yeah. Basically, that's all this is. It's like g- attack on domains that the enemy is not capable of perceiving as a threat. Now, obviously, if there were a king of America, like a human being empowered to exercise judgment, then he could just say, well, it's not technically a declaration of war, but these guys are clearly screwing us and being hostile, and so we're going to put a stop to it. But because it's this faceless bureaucracy, it can't react that way. So, like the example that Kilcullen gives in Dragons and Snakes is like they'll buy a hotel on a hilltop over like every American naval base, right? And so we're allowing them to set up listening posts because uh, they're not representatives of the Chinese Communist Party. They don't have any explicit ties. It's just Chinese nationals. Uh, we have our like racial hangups that say you can't assume that someone's hot. Like it's like, you want to go back to the Japanese internment camps. Like you can't assume that somebody's sort of affiliated with their home nation just because they're affiliated with their home nation. And it's the ability of the system to respond to these threats is essentially nil. And so what I'm saying is like we can take advantage of that as well. We can build the kinds of institutions that that carve out sovereignty for ourselves without pulling aggro, so to speak.
Yes, this concept of pulling aggro, I think it's very important. Do you want to explain it more for the audience?
Yeah, so like in video games, pulling aggro is doing something that will cause a computer enemy to focus on you and to start attacking you. In group role playing games, group like World of Warcraft, in a raid, the people who do lots of damage, but are sort of easy to kill, they have to be concerned about pulling aggro because if they do enough damage to the bad guy, he'll come after them and then immediately kill them. And so it's about how do you maximize the amount of damage you can do to the enemy without triggering response, keeping him focused on beating up the tanks, beating up the guys whose job it is to get beat up. We are up against a cybernetic organism. We are up against a non-human entity that cannot exercise human judgment. And so there are things we can do that get what we want without pulling aggro.
Right. And how does that play out in the real world? How does that play out when we're dealing with the US government, for example, or with your HR department?
Yeah, well, so like I said, just stepping outside of the W-2 makes a huge difference. Also, getting yourself in situations where your skills are more transferable, more marketable on the outside, pursuing parallel opportunities. I know guys uh, who are basically continually applying for other jobs, and it's not because they're necessarily going to take those jobs. It's so that in their salary negotiations, sometimes these guys have them, quarterly almost because they have such a strong negotiating position. But so that in those salary negotiations, they can always say, I've got this in hand. Like I have this alternative that I'm considering. So creating situations where you are in a stronger position relative to your employer, or just you don't have an employer. That's probably the biggest one. A lot of what has happened over the last basically decade is that the social enforcement of sort of managerial norms led people sort of in an instinctive evolutionary process to bifurcate the society. You just had enough fights with like your liberal cousin or your liberal coworker that you realize like I just can't have an ongoing like intimate social relationship with this person. So I better go find some other friends. And part of what's happened is like we've just stopped having friends, which that's a real problem. But what has also happened is like the friends I have are going to be people with whom I can have these conversations. It's connecting with people socially, like networking socially, so that your friends are people who share your values. You can't be beat over the head with like you can't sit at our lunch table anymore if you have these opinions. Professionally, like how am I gonna earn a living when I have these opinions and I want to express them? And then also like with my kids, like you're going to be on the wrong side of history is sort of the threat that is deployed, and I think it's really effective on the boomers. And the reason it's so effective on the boomers is that what they're really saying is we're going to make sure that your kids despise you. We're going to make sure that your grandchildren aren't even allowed to be around you. That's the threat. And so taking responsibility for your kids' education and acculturation, making sure that they don't have the opportunity to poison your kids against you, that's a huge source of leverage. In the near term, like the immediate things you can do to resist these systems. And then it's about mutual aid. It's about like how do we solve problems in our community? How do we make ourselves useful to the local like local law enforcement, local emergency response, local logistics as the bigger picture systems break down and become more hostile and become less responsive. We are positioned to be involved in the provision of those basic services. That's what a proto state is.
Yes, it goes back to obedience and protection always.
Yeah, a state is whoever provides those basics of security and credibility and provides a framework in which other people are able to flourish. And I think that's a good thing. I don't have a negative view of the state in principle. Like I said with the family metaphor, I think states are basically just abstractions of family. And it starts with strong families. It starts with a handful of guys who have strong families who need to be in charge so that their families can flourish. Because the big picture mechanisms that provide those things are collapsing. There's almost a rhyme with like the natalism issue, because like the natalism issue can be construed as like, oh, we need to resist this tidal wave that's coming. And similarly, like a lot of people like the sort of errors of the 90s with like the militia movement was like, oh, we need to like explicitly fight back against the state. No, you just get swamped, you just get crushed, you get destroyed.
Yes.
What you want to do is be there when that thing passes. Be there when that thing collapses and is no longer viable. We don't have to do anything for this thing to collapse. It's doing just fine on its own.
What's interesting is that the collapse can happen in partial ways. I think the term in our circles is, narco tyranny, right?
Yeah.
Where, for example, the electricity grid in LA will collapse. You'll still have the HR departments, and the police and SF will not
Yeah.
enforce like literal violent assaults. But they'll, really get up the asses of the people putting up the X sign, if you remember this,
Yeah. You can destroy, but you're not
And
allowed to build.
what's really interesting with this concept of drawing aggro is that it's an unsolved problem how to create the alternative SF police without drawing aggro. No one knows how to do that yet, right?
Well,
And maybe someone.
I don't think that you do that in SF.
Sure, sure.
Like what we're asking, right, is like, how do you provide security? And the way you provide security to Bay Area smart people is not by replacing the San Francisco Police Department. The way you do it is by creating a safer place somewhere else, at least in the short run.
I know a few people, I think the podcast two before this one will be with Mark Lutter of Charter Cities Institute, who has a plan to take over the Presidio. And I don't think you've solved the underlying question. And I think the underlying question is important, which is that you're going to end up in a scenario where the state kind of loses partial legitimacy, fails to provide some utilities, and yet still kind of has the monopoly on violence.
Sure. Yeah.
And I don't know what to do in that scenario. I want you
Well,
to tell me.
one of the things that we discussed in the podcast on dragons and snakes was Hezbollah. And Hezbollah started as like clinics and schools and like feeding hungry kids. Like it was uh, very much like a community organizer type of a thing. And they drew some money from the American diaspora. They drew some money from Iran. And as things got spicier in Lebanon, they started doing like neighborhood watches. And those neighborhood watches turned into militias, essentially. It's sort of like Balaji's thing about land last, but not land never. I would say security last, but not security never, right? Because, yeah, that is the fundamental service that the state will not tolerate competitors. What you want, the position you want to be in, is one where, well, so basically the premise of your question, which I would maybe dispute if I'm understanding it correctly, is that a deep breakdown of that kind can happen, that the state can maintain power in the long term under those conditions. And I think South Africa is an interesting thing to point to, maybe in both directions, because like what South Africa indicates is that, like, yeah, a state can weather an incredible amount of dysfunction, an incredible amount of dysfunction. But when you talk to like Afrikaners or English South Africans about how security is provided, it's like the police are not capable of stopping you from defending yourself. Like they're not, they don't actually maintain a monopoly on violence. Like a huge amount of the defensive violence that takes place in South Africa is private. And it takes place either with the official blessing of at least local law enforcement, or it happens just beyond their control. And that's on top of the fact that South Africa, the security situation in South Africa cannot be understood outside the context of the global empire,
Yes.
right? And so if the United States were to become something more like South Africa, South Africa would cease to be like South Africa. A lot of what the empire is doing right now is holding open a bunch of wounds. It's leaving a bunch of conflicts unresolved because it can't tolerate the competition for power that would emerge, the new power structures that would emerge if those questions were resolved decisively. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict just was held open forever and ever and ever. That can't be understood outside the context of empire. As US power declines, there will still be places in the US that are anarcho tyrannical, places you don't want to be, but lots of other places that have been held in this anarcho tyrannical condition by the empire itself will have their uh, political and security arrangements resolved decisively, and they'll become nice places to live. I think mobility is going to matter a lot, and flexibility and willingness to relocate might be very important. And I respect guys who say like I don't care, I'm never leaving. But I think the people who will do the best under those conditions are people who are willing to evaluate their security environment and take steps to get a better one.
It's kind of hard to draw historical analogs to modern militaries because you're right that the US is an empire, but it has a very strange way of power projection. And there are kind of two ways we can go here. One is that, at least until very recently, you could at least make the case that the US was much more of a soft power empire. Yeah, like if China wants Taiwan, I don't think there is anything militarily we can do. There
No.
will be economic consequences for the both of us, but I do not think there is a U.S. military solution outside of literally mutually assured destruction that will stop China from taking Taiwan.
Yeah.
I think that's like honestly very demonstrable, and the only reason people deny this is because they're in the U.S. military industrial complex echo chamber. But to
Well,
return to the
I don't
original
think any
point,
of that can be disentangled. I don't think the hard and soft can be disentangled. Like I think power is just power. And
I
like
don't think that's true. Like China, like clearly has more military capability than like international media capability, right?
sure, my point
He
would
just
be that
lacks the riz.
my point would be that international media power is power just the same as tanks and bombs are. So like
I mean,
if we're preventing them from taking Taiwan for trade reasons or economic reasons or political reasons or cultural reasons or media reasons, the point is we're preventing them from taking Taiwan. Like
sure.
that's a reality.
I mean that's true. It is definitely true that it is a lever that you can pull to get the result that you want, right?
And I think the Chinese
Which is them
actually
not taking
understand that
Taiwan.
too.
There's definitely this case where like the reality is that we are stopping China from invading Taiwan, or just that they're not invading Taiwan,
Yeah.
right? Through economic means, through cultural means, so on. Um,
And
I
I
think
think the
that's
Chinese
definitely true.
understand that too. And I think the Chinese in Dragons and Snakes, one of Kilcullen's concepts that he talks about is conceptual envelopment. That's how he talks about unrestricted warfare. So you've got a blocking force, like the main force that is holding the line, keeping the enemy occupied, and then the flanking force is to roll them up from the side, right? So you need both of them, right? Like if all you had was the flanking force, then the army would turn to face you and attack you that way. So basically, my belief about China's military buildup is that it's a pure blocking force. I don't think there will ever be a military invasion of Taiwan, or if there is, it will be after it's completely. They'll roll in. Hitler rolled into Austria. Like it's not going to be. It's not going to be a problem. The purpose of that blocking force is, I think, to keep the United States building aircraft carriers and missiles and tanks and F 35 to keep us spending and thinking in that domain while they win the war in the other domains. That's currently where they have us, or where we have them at a disadvantage, is in all the soft stuff. This is something that I have a lot of arguments with some friends about who are like, oh, China's going to just take over. They're going to be the new hegemon of the whole planet. And my criticism of that is like they're not even making overtures toward that. Like their military production, their buildup is entirely about the South China Sea. They are not trying to build global force projection capacity, and they totally could if they wanted to. So like they're clear, it's a deliberate decision to maintain this blocking force while they expand in other domains. And they're basically doing the same thing that I'm advocating that we do, which is don't pull aggro. Don't pick a fight that will be destructive. Just wait and win and build in all these other domains. I think that's smart play. I think they're going to be screwed by demographics, but I think every other aspect of their play is really strong.
Yeah, it's just really hard to disentangle. I'm a China doomer for all sorts. In some ways, they're like both a lot more managerial than the U.S.
Yeah.
and less managerial, right? They have people who read Strauss. They kind of have Straussians in control,
Mm-hmm.
um, but they also the Chinese Straussians also have a kind of like apathy and acceptance towards like the political science way of doing things.
Yeah.
It's a very curious combination. The underlying reality for that is that they're kind of all in on the current paradigm. As a regime, they're less philosophical, but as a kind of governing class, they're more philosophical.
Well, I would be interested in in your take on or like what you mean when you say that they're Straussian.
Oh, that they literally read and cite Strauss.
Well, okay, but like I haven't read Strauss, so what does that mean? How does that cash out?
Uh, I mean, it's a lot to explain in a few minutes, but a kind of understanding of the importance of philosophy, of ancient philosophy, particularly of ancient virtues. I think that's apparent in the regime. Strauss is also very critical of the kind of social science way of doing things. I spoke earlier about his analogy of the worm, where he sees political scientists as kind of cutting up the regime into such small bits that it gives you no meaning about the whole, that basically people are like hyper fixated on these small empirical details that actually like literally don't matter at all. Um, and kind of criticism of safety in a way of taking the survival of the individual or even of the regime as the utmost good.
Yeah.
Um, there's a lot of big ideas there. I think
Yeah.
one way in which it is true is that the Chinese regime clearly has a conception of the common good and a conception of virtue. I'm not saying that is a necessarily a good conception of virtue, but they believe in it. They
Yeah.
believe in themselves in a way that I think American elites on both sides of the aisle simply
Oh,
do not.
totally. Totally.
Um, Another way is this is the contradiction, right? In some ways, they're more philosophical. I think philosophers in China are much higher status than they are in the US.
Hmm.
Like she will speak with them and quote them and so on. Um, but it's kind of hard to tell how that translates into their government, because their government is also very, very managerial.
Yeah. Well,
So it's like
I
I
think
guess in the citations you can see it, even if it's questionable how much that translates into practice.
they had the second mover advantage on a lot of technical and manufacturing, industrial development, and I think what we're seeing now is the fruit of hyper optimization for an ecosystem that is dying. So the managerial ecosystem, or the ecosystem in which managerialism is the right play, in which everything is about massive return to industrial scale. Um, the Chinese sort of internalized, accrued, just sort of ground level, the technological advancements and the machines they needed to build. But also, they took the 20th century. They did a synthesis of that dialectic of the 20th century between communism and fascism and liberal democracy. They've sort of perfected managerialism. They've taken all of those three systems and they've combined them. And the problem is that essentially drones and crypto and AI are going to render managerialism obsolete and or render irrelevant its ability to marshal that kind of scale. Yeah, I agree with you that I'm a China doomer too. I do think that it bottoms out, and this is maybe brings it back to the conference and the issue of natalism. It really bottoms out at like, isn't it weird that the Chinese are so self confident? They're so like, they're the rising power. They've got all the muscle and they're macho and they're kick ass, but they still can't persuade their young people to have children. They still can't persuade their young people to raise families. They can't accomplish this like the most basic like care and feeding of human beings is to get them to reproduce. So what's going wrong? What are they getting wrong? That maybe doesn't explain the whole doomer, the China doomer hypothesis for me, but it's a synecdoche of it. It contains the explanation.
Nick Land has this line, Neo China arrives from the future. There's a kind of like Bay Area rejection of feminism, right? Which is the rationalist, Scott Alexander type guy who is in some ways very, very, very non-feminine. They're, autistic, they're willing to offend people, but in some ways are not masculine either, right? They're a kind of empty rejection of feminism. And I think that may actually be the most important philosophical question going on in China, philosophical experiment even
They
of
reject
like,
feminism. They reject feminism on the same basis that like an AI will reject feminism because it will just look at the
yeah,
facts and
yeah,
it will
China
say,
is kind of like maybe not an AI, but in some ways China is like the rationalist occupied government.
"That's terrific." I hope that's true.
And I think maybe that actually is like unfair to the Chinese government, which once again like at least like asks themselves the philosophical questions and have like clearly read Strauss and Hobbes and Schmidt. Yeah, it is the question of like, does this androgynous rejection of feminism, does it work? And so far, at least, the answer seems to be like clearly no.
I wrote an article titled "The Chinese are doing everything right and they're still going to lose," and I was being a little clickbaity there, but they have been doing a lot of things right. They've been smart in like a lot of ways that Europe and the US have been stupid and like insanely stupid. And yet, there's no growth curve that no plausible growth curve that replaces the fact they just can't get they can't make any more Chinese people. They're just done making Chinese people.
Yeah, this is kind of spiritual sequel to the pronatalism article that I'm writing called like East Asian Fatalism. I just think that like Chinese culture and Chinese philosophy, especially like current day Chinese philosophy, they're just like natural preppers. They want the regime to end, even if they are the regime. they're
Oh,
they're just like
interesting.
waiting for the next thing. Yeah, they're waiting for like the next reunification and the next civil war. Like they're waiting for the next thing. That's Chinese culture. You're waiting for the next regime. And like all of these people are like, reclaiming are in very philosophical and sophisticated ways. This is maybe the most important way that Chinese officials are Straussian, is that like they are like serving members of like the PLA conference legislators or whatever, and like deep down they just want to do the next thing. They just want to like see the next empire and prep for the next empire.
That's crazy. They're barely at the top of this one. Yeah,
Yeah, well, the top might come sooner than you think. Who knows?
yeah. That's fun.
Is there anything you wanna shill leak about the conference? Some
Oh,
spicy
geez.
details, some exclusives for the podcast.
Oh man, some exclusives. I don't know about exclusives. We've had we had our first hit piece come out this week, and it was really exciting because I got on the phone with like some really impressive potential guests. I can't give you the exclusive, Brian. I'm sorry,
Aw,
but
it's okay.
basically, I mean it cracked the thing wide open to where like I'm no longer concerned about selling the tickets. Like it's we're gonna fill it up. It's gonna be great.
Are we having a certain contrarian?
Uh, uh, yes, but maybe not the one you're thinking of.
Okay, okay. Yeah.
But yeah, it's going to be incredible. The people that came last year were so simultaneously just like excellent, dynamic, smart. Like the unconference portion was actually a lot of people said the best because it was an incredibly rich conversation with people who I think a lot of those people had not yet had an experience where they were surrounded by people who were simultaneously so bright and dynamic and also so values aligned. It sort of presaged the tech Trump merger because there was a lot of traditional Christians there, but there were also a lot of kind of Bay Area tech types there, and it turned out they had a blast. They just had a great time together, and um,
Oh, interesting. Okay.
yeah. I mean, uh, would not have. I guess I expected that it would go well, but that there would be more friction. But it turned out like we number one, I think babies are just fundamentally a unifying. Like people just they're in a good mood around babies. Psychologically normal, healthy people like babies. They like talking about babies. It put everyone in a very warm mood to have that conversation. And so we're going to be doing that. We're going to be doing some element of like mixer content, and we're probably gonna make it a little bit easier for the ladies to show up than the fellas to balance out the ratios. So that's going to be good. And then probably gonna do some outside stuff too because it's $1,000 for the ticket, and I don't apologize for that because you're paying for the quality of the people. It was an incredible group, but we do want to create some situations where people who maybe can't afford that $1,000 price point can come do some mixer stuff and get to know the speakers and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's gonna be a good time.
Yeah. Have you seen the meme that's like quality price curve of the conference?
No, I haven't.
It's basically like a U curve, right?
Right.
If the conference is like free, all expenses paid, or if the conference is like $10,000, then it's going to be good.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think that's true. Even like otherwise weird populations. It's not just a gate for wealth; it's also a gate for like commitment to the issue and like interest.
I think that like most people who are like upper middle class would pay like $1,000 for something if they thought it had like if they
Civilizational
thought it would be like
significance.
really, yeah, civilizational significance, or just like really like personally impactful, right?
Right. Right.
Like
That's
if
what
they
we're
thought
aiming
they were
for.
going to like find someone they at least have a good relationship with, romantic relationship with. um
Yeah.
I was gonna say marriage. I think actually people would pay way more if they had a chance at a successful marriage. I feel like it's really hard for me to name a name that would be like really surprising to me at this point. I don't know. Is Alex Karp coming?
Uh,
That would be a little surprising to me,
you're
at least a
you're you're
little.
you're barking up the wrong scene there. It's a completely different scene. Uh,
Hints. What's the
these
what's
are
the scene? You can tell me
these
the
are these
scene,
are
right?
these are these are people that your mom and your aunts and your grandma have heard of probably. I guess I
Hmm.
don't know your mom and grandma and aunts, but like a typical American mainstream normie person would know.
Yeah. Is JD coming?
I'm not going to take any more guesses.
Okay, understandable. That's a great place to end the podcast
But
on
come and
an
see.
uncertain note of whether JD is coming. Thank you so much for doing the podcast, for organizing the conference. Do you have a code to shill?
Oh, don't give anyone a code because then it's full. No, natalism is a code that works. I can give
Hold
you
on.
I can give you a
Natalism
code.
is a code that okay. Sure, I'll take a code.
I
Listening, they'll know natalism is a code that works.
when are you
Natalism.
gonna when are you gonna take this
Um,
live?
Either next week or the week after.
Okay, then yeah, offer code chow.
Fun, fun.
All right, man. Thanks a lot.